There was a judge once in South China a long time ago, during the reign of the Emperor Yao it was, named Cao Yu. He was stern in his rulings, but fair and patient, and all but legendary for his honesty. It would have been a foolish criminal, or yes, even a misguided emperor, who attempted to bribe or coerce Cao Yu. Of early middle years, he was stocky and wide-shouldered, if a little plump, and the features of his face were strong and striking, even if his hairline was retreating just a trifle. He was respected by all, and feared by those who should have feared him. What more can one ask from a judge even now? But this is a story about a case in which he came to feel, rightly or no, that he was the one on trial. Well, welcome once again to the Guild podcast, the podcast of W.A.R.G, the Writers, Artists, and Readers Guild. That was from The Overneath, a short story from The Overneath, which is Peter S Beagle's new short story collection. And it's very fun to announce that we have Peter S Beagle himself on the show today. He's been very influential on me and many people. And we talk about that a little bit, or at least we talk about Neil Gaiman speaking of him as the gold standard. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm very excited to have Peter S Beagle. He has so much to say. He's a storyteller of note. I basically try to sit back and just let him talk. We could have probably spoken a lot longer than the hour or so that we do. But anyway, I think without further ado, I think we'll jump right in to the episode. Thanks for doing this. I appreciate it a lot. I know you're probably very busy.
But as I say, catch me now.
Okay. So what I would like to do is talk a little bit about your writing and your idea of writing and your forthcoming books. I think a lot of people and a lot of people that listen to our podcast are interested in the creative process, as it were. And
but go ahead.
No, yes, and that was what we were interested in, kind of what your philosophy on writing is, having written for quite some time. When we spoke last week, we were talking a little bit about A Fine and Private Place.
Right. The best I know to tell your listeners, is that it hasn't gotten any easier since A Fine and Private Place. In fact, it's harder because back then I was 19 years old and I didn't know. Are you there, by the way?
Yeah, I'm still here. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
And I didn't know how difficult it was. It was, you can call it beginner's luck or just plain ignorance, because I just wrote the stories. I went along, and I was very lucky because I had a very good editor. His name is Marshall with two L's,
mm-hmm.
Marshall Best, and he went over that story with me over and over, and I fought him every step of the way because I was 19 years old and everything I had written was golden. And if it hadn't been for him, for his editing, I'm really not sure that book would still be in print.
Oh, really? So how did that come about? Your writing. I mean, when you were 19, had you decided that you wanted to be a writer, or were you just going to give it a try?
Oh, I decided that much earlier. I knew I was very young that I wanted to be a writer, simply because reading gave me such pleasure, such sensual pleasure, for lack of a better word.
Okay.
So I want to do that. I can remember having a teacher in second and third grades. Her name was Maggie Butterwick, Butterweck. She was a tall, skinny Irish lady, and she loved me. I knew that, and I loved her. And however strange or weird I was in the neighborhood, I was pretty strange, I was safe in her class. She told my parents not to worry about my grades or about my lack of sociability or the fact that I sat in the back of her class writing poetry about Tarzan, the Lone Ranger, that sort of thing. And I think the proudest moment I've ever had was when I brought her a copy of my first novel and tried to her, because we'd stayed friends, till she died. But what I remember also is that when I was about 9, I was home with some sort of respiratory problem. I had a lot of those as a boy. Mm-hmm. And she sent me a copy of the book, The Wind in the Willows, by friend Kenneth Graham. And I knew I wanted to do that. Okay. Whatever on earth that was, I wanted to do that, and I wanted to be able to make people feel the way that book made me feel.
Well, The Wind in the Willows is an excellent book to start out with, to be inspired by, I feel.
It is to me. I still look at it. I go back to old books that made a difference to my life. I reread, and that's one I know practically by heart, if I think about it. And there are others, but I can remember meeting a woman at a Hollywood party. It was a Hollywood lunch, really. We'd never met. We were assigned to the same table. There were a lot of little tables, a lot of people sitting out in the sun with them. And she was older than I, delightful, charming. Mostly we spoke about books. Mm-hmm. And at a certain point, she turned on me and said, "Writers. I know about writers. I was married to a writer. Goddamn emotional miser, the lot of you. You're so afraid, wake up one morning, it'll all be gone." And literally, my hair stood up, because that was just close enough to daily fears, to nightmares that we all have to one degree or another. Later, I found out that she'd been married not once, but twice, to a writer who was one of my childhood heroes. And the thing is that it's true. In a large sense, we don't know quite what we do, what it is we do. And I'm always surprised when I finish a book and realize, that's the end. I just finished it. Because at some point, at least from my point of view, it's a bit more than a bit magic. And there are times when it doesn't get any easier at the moment. On the one hand, I've had, for me, a very prolific period. I've had 2 novels out in this last year. Yeah. And here comes the book of short stories. And I'm proud of all of them. But right now, I'm into a new novel, and it's driving me nuts. And I can be very, very easily affected by other people's work. Mm-hmm. So that, as I recently wrote, I correspond with a Nigerian-American writer. I can't pronounce her name properly. Maybe Okorafor. Mm-hmm. And I said when we met at a convention, she gave me a novel of hers, I think her first. And I wrote to her that after I got through with that, I wondered if it was too late for me to go into another line of work. Because she affected me that much. People do. Mm. Sometimes I become a prisoner of my admiration. Wow, I wish I could do that. Yeah. Like that.
Well, I think I listened to an interview. I can't remember who it was by or who they were interviewing, but he was talking about that when he writes, when he's in a period of writing, he never reads that type of fiction. So if he's writing a horror story, he won't read horror at that time. He'll read something else, romance or fantasy, because he's afraid that he'll be too affected and it'll be too plagiaristic.
Entirely possible. I know that I'm an instant literary mimic. Maybe that's why I had some work in Hollywood adapting other people's work. Mm-hmm. That's just it was, but I know that I can catch, especially somebody I really admire, I can catch the other person's style drifting into my work almost immediately. It happens fast, and I just have to keep an eye out for it. That's the way I've always been. I memorize stories. I know altogether too much too much poetry by heart and old songs. I wake up with old songs in my head, and the only way to get rid of them is to start a backfire and start thinking of some other song that will drive that one out. But it happens like that. A little while ago, I was reading one of Rudyard Kipling's Mowgli stories, one of his Jungle Book stories, which he wrote, by the way, when he was living in Vermont. And I remember how much of this story, and this one in particular, I know by heart. And it's not a question of imitating it, but of course, when you get to my age, you look back at all the voices you can hear in your own head, all your imitations, and you finally, though, you get to a point where the real danger is imitating yourself, where you realize I'm not going to bother with this book. I already wrote that. I try to keep the stories, the books, as different from each other as I possibly can, which is why I've never had any sort of series. And some very good writers have remarkable series. I've got one here right now, as a matter of fact, mystery writer. But it's just a very strange way to make a living. I just never felt that there was anything else I could do. I really didn't. I've had friends who I thought could have been marvelous writers, who were marvelous writers when they bothered to do it. But they had so many other talents, so many other gifts dragging them in different directions that in a way I envied them, and in a way I was glad I didn't have that problem, at least. I knew there was just this one thing. It was a lot simpler in that way.
Is that is that an author's biggest issue or biggest enemy, to get distracted by other things, to be easily distracted? Do you think? It varies from person to person. It's a common one, but everybody's got different bugaboos, different professional enemies. I know that I really will. Neil Gaiman, who's a good friend and a very nice man, hung me up a couple of years back when he referred to me, and he's always been very kind. He referred to me in his blog as the gold standard of American fantasy. And on the one hand, it was a very sweet thing to say, but it hung me up, because I'd look at a paragraph or a page and think, with a gold standard of American fantasy like that crap, and I'd start over. I'd do something else. I finally got over it, but I don't think Neil will ever know what problems he caused me. That's very, very funny, because we all, as writers, I think we all kind of get hung up with our own, insecurities, definitely.
That comes with business.
Yeah. But if we look at when you start a book, if we look at in Calabria, for instance, that I read recently and reviewed and thought was a very, very fun book, a very poetic book to read. How did that come about? How does
I can't really tell you. I'm honestly not sure of what the origins were. I should be, because that's one book I'm very proud of. And it's a book that I keep looking back at. I don't usually reread my own work, except for a few things. I'll reread that book in Calabria, or I'll reread Tansen. And the Innkeepers song, to remind myself that on a good day, when the wind's right, I'm good. But it's really like that. There's a sonnet of Shakespeare's in which he talks about just I look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing myself to him more full of hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy, contented least. And frankly, it's a great comfort on a bad day to know that Shakespeare had days like that.
Yeah. You talk about a gold standard.
Right, but it's just reassuring, especially because he wrote and rewrote. He cannibalized old plays of his and used them for something else. The English have this desert island program. I think they still have it, where you're always asked if you're shipwrecked on this or that imaginary desert island, what books would you take with you? And my immediate response has always been Shakespeare and the collected Mark Twain, because you can always reread them and find something else. If I'm going to be on that island for a long time, I'm going to need stuff I can reread.
Yes. Definitely. So what does your process look like once you've somehow found a topic that you wanna write about?
Then, and I've said this before, basically, I'm making it up as I go along, which I do not recommend to anybody who wants to be a writer. I always tell people to plan things out in advance, to get some notion of where you're going, and particularly, how it's going to end. But I never know what the end's going to be. And the book I'm working on right now, working title is Soothes, S-O-O-Z, told from the point of view of a young woman who narrates Two Hearts, which is a sequel to The Last Unicorn. And she narrates that when she's 9 years old. Now she's 17. And she's just discovered that she has an older sister her family never talks about, who ran off with the fairies, the night folks, the night people, when she was 4 years old or thereabouts. And Sue determines to go out and find her. And right now, I know on a certain point, up to now, it's good. I know it's good. But at this point, I'm going around in circles, stomping around in my room, mumbling and cursing. All right, now what? What the hell happens now? Sooner or later, I'll figure it out, and it'll look so simple that I'll think, idiot. It was staring you in the face all the time. But I always go through this. The only book that I can remember being a snap, so to speak, one was nonfiction. It was about traveling across country with my closest friend on a couple of motor scooters back in '93.
Okay.
A book called 1963. A book called I See by My Outfit, and that was fun. I wrote that in a few months. And on the other hand, I've got a couple of books that cost me 15 to 18 years. I'm slow. I was distracted with other work, but the thing thing most common is that I really don't know where the hell I'm going. And a friend of mine, whom I admire greatly, somebody I've known for a long time, when he's writing a novel, tears straight through without even looking back, without ever rewriting while he's going along. Then he says, I go back and try to go over it and try to make it look as though I knew what I was doing all along. I understand that. I wish I could do that, but I fall into a trap that I've always warned other writers, younger ones, against, trying to write the third draft while you're writing the first. That's always a mistake, and I fall into it again and again. Trying to make it perfect on the first draft. You can't. At least I can't.
You said that that this book that you're working on now is a book that narrates Two Hearts, and Two Hearts is related to
narrator. Yeah.
Yes, and is related to The Last Unicorn. This book that is coming out in November, The Overneath.
Yes.
does it also connect to The Last Unicorn in some
Only
way?
in a sense, only in a sense that there are a couple of stories about very young Schmendrick,
Okay.
the magician. There are two stories in there, both before the time of Schmendrick's encounter with the last unicorn. And there may be one or two stories set in a fairy tale world that could be the time of the last unicorn, or there might not be.
Okay.
And there's a story in there I'm particularly proud of called The Queen Who Could Not Walk. And I had no idea where that was going, or how it was going to come out. The ending surprised me, as it will surprise anybody.
Mm-hmm.
But the only thing I can think of is I was married for quite a while to a wonderful Indian writer, and when I look at this and other stories, I can realize, oh, her fingerprints are all over that one. She would have done that, or praised me for doing it. She would have liked this one. She was a major influence for many years, still is. And other stories, there's a foreword or some paragraph or so before each story in that collection. And there are a couple whose genesis I simply can't understand. I don't know where the hell that one came from, how I wrote it. It happens with everything. Sometimes you look back. I look back at the first one, A Fine and Private Place, and I don't know how I wrote that. What I usually say is I didn't know any better. And I can't judge it to this day. I can't talk about it in any balanced way. I know that I was imitating a writer who later became the nearest thing I've ever had to a mentor, Robert Mason.
Mm-hmm.
I know that I was in love with a book Robert had written at least 6 years before I was born, and I just wanted to write that, and he already had. It's like when I've heard what's his name, George Lucas's producer and friend, saying what we wanted to make was a remake of the old 30s serial Flash Gordon,
Mm-hmm.
but the rights were already tied up, so we started Star Wars instead. And so like that, I wanted to write a book called One More Spring, but Robert already had. So I wrote A Fine and Private Place instead.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Was it easier, do you think, to break into writing when you started writing than it is like today when you look at maybe younger writers, and especially I think like fantasy writers, with everything that you have, people are self-publishing and there are so many
Right.
different small publishers and stuff like that. Do you think was it easier in your day, or is it easier now?
I think it's easier now for the reasons you just enumerated. I know that when I started, it was another world, for lack of I don't know how else to describe it. I knew and met at my agent's office. I knew people who were astonishingly popular then and were publishing in the slick magazines like the Saturday Evening Post, Collier's, and so on. There's some wonderful writing done then, but it was a closed world for the unpublished. I don't even say amateur, but for the unpublished, because self-publishing was considered, a disgrace, really. And I was very lucky. I was incredibly lucky. I happened to be sort of adopted in the literary sense by the old poet Louis Untermeyer and his wife, Vina Ivins, who was the fiction editor of 17 magazine.
Oh.
And I sent a story to their annual writing contest when I was 15. I didn't win, but it provoked Bryna's interest, and she determined to get in touch with me, which was difficult because I'd forgotten to put a return address on the envelope or on the manuscript. Fortunately, the things had to be notarized before they were sent in, and the notary stamp mentioned the Bronx, New York City, and anybody named Beagle in New York City, is a relative.
Okay.
So Bryna was able to track me down, and she and Louis, her husband, who knew everybody in the publishing world, would invite me to their house in Newtown, Connecticut, ironically, for weekends. And when I was 17, they handed me over to my first agent, Elizabeth Otis, O-T-I-S, who happened to be John Steinbeck's agent and Harper Lee's agent and people like that. Mm-hmm. And she treated me at 17 like a real writer, which I wasn't. But she would take me to lunch and talk to me about my work. And when I found out later, when I was 19, she got a bid for a fine and private place from Doubleday, which she turned down without telling me about it because she didn't think Doubleday was quite the right house for a young writer. And instead, she waited to see if Viking Press would make a bid, and they did. And I can remember, I was still in college in Pittsburgh, and I can remember getting my letter from Elizabeth, who had over the years sort of became my aunt. Elizabeth telling me that there was a bid from Viking on a fine and private place and an advance of $500, which is more than I've certainly ever seen in one place. And I can remember walking dazedly through the streets of Pittsburgh, several inches off the ground, just singing to myself and absolutely dazed that my fantasy had come true. That really was going to be a published writer. And I remember that in a way I don't remember a lot of other things.
No, but I can imagine it's a big thing. Your genre, people mostly know you as a fantasy author, if one was to categorize. Was that a genre that was frowned upon in the 60s when you started writing?
Well, that's another thing. You see, now everything is genreified, if I can make up that word. Mm-hmm. Back then, Robert Mason was a fantasy writer in his own way. He's always playing with the edge of fantasy. Okay, there are no invasions from outer space, so to speak, and no Armageddons building up toward the end of the book. There were fantasies, and but they were published like any other novel and reviewed like any other novel. There was a lot more. There was a lot less, rather, of the categorization of books and a lot fewer mass reviews. The same way there are several fantasies out at the same time, more or less. Usually, major publications like the New York Times, they'll be tossed into a bag and assigned to this particular editor, specialty supposedly that is, who will review the books in one glob, one mass. On the other hand, that's changing too. I have a good friend, the only person I know who's won a National Book Award. In this case, it was for young adult literature. And there's a week or two ago, there's a splendid review in the New York Times Book Review about his most recent book. And I called him. I was so delighted to see that. And so that's changing too. I think perhaps because publishers have become aware that there's a lot of money in children's literature, as there's a lot more money than there used to be in fantasy, science fiction. And in the end, that's the deciding factor, the turning point. My God, there's money in this. Like that.
when you started, you said that inspiration came from, among other, Kenneth Grahame, and you've mentioned Kipling, and you've mentioned other people. Were there contemporary? I mean, how was your relation to, if one were to talk about like the big icons in fantasy literature, like Tolkien, maybe Robert E. Howard, who wrote Conan. Did you have any relation to those authors at all? Like that you were inspired by them or were aware of them, or?
That's the funny thing. When I wrote, I see by my outfit, Phil, my friend Phil and me crossing the country, I had a reference to Tolkien, going through Cleveland, both of us thinking it reminded us of the Tolkien's picture of Mordor. But the thing is that the editor at that time asked me to put in a description, or not a description, and make it clear to readers who J.R. Tolkien actually was. Because it was, at that time, very much a private secret that you shared with friends.
Okay.
It wasn't a big bestseller of that sort, by any means. I can remember I was selling a lot of pieces to Holiday magazine at that time. They were a very good magazine. They weren't necessarily strictly a travel magazine. I could write almost anything for them. But they turned me down when I wrote on spec a piece about Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings, because they rejected it on the grounds that Tolkien was not contemporary enough.
Oh, okay.
That would have been about 1964. Shortly after that, of course, the great Tolkien explosion happened, and I was getting messages from friends congratulating me on having written the introduction to the Tolkien reader. I did? Really? And then it dawned on me, for God's sake, of course, Ian Ballantyne, who was a remarkable legend in publishing and a good friend, had stayed at my house overnight and slept on the couch. Didn't have a guest room of any sort in the shack. But I'd given him that rejected piece to read. And I didn't realize that it had gone back to New York with him. And I called him. Ian, tell me about the Tolkien reader. And I didn't tell you about that? You mean I didn't send you the check? Oh, for goodness sake. And to do Ian perfect justice, he sent the check right away. But he never told me that he'd taken it with him to New York, or that it was the introduction, used as the introduction to the Tolkien reader. And from that point on, I was renowned or recognized as an expert on Tolkien, which I'm not.
Okay. And
more than that, I still, every once in a while, get letters in Elvish, which I can't read. But there are fans out there who just assume I can.
And then you wrote the script for the animated Lord of the Rings, which must have been an experience in itself.
It was an experience all by itself. And as I say, it's a long story. But Tolkien was not an influence of mine. That's the strange, not at all.
No.
When I was a writing student at the University of Pittsburgh, which I think in those days was one of maybe 3 universities that had degrees or courses in creative writing. And at that time, we were, instructed that to read people like Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald and John Dos Passos, the usual canon of that time. And I was already hooked on strange, out-of-the-way fantasy writers like Lord Dunsany, which was an influence of mine, as he was on Tolkien and Robert Howard and Ursula Le Guin is quite right when she says that he's the father of us all. And he was still publishing when I was in college. But my writing teachers, Ed Peterson, to whom last year A Fine and Private Place is partly dedicated, knew whom I was reading and knew about Robert Mason, and just told me to keep reading while I was reading, read everybody, write the way I wrote, and if I didn't, go to Africa and shoot big game, or get drunk and jump in the fountains and, in front of fancy hotels in New York. That was okay, really. But there were a lot of people, and that young writers in that generation, who really thought that they couldn't live like Hemingway. They couldn't possibly write like Hemingway.
Mm-hmm.
And so, on the one hand, I was never influenced by Hemingway, while on the other hand, I was reading French playwrights like Jean Giraudoux or Jean Anouilh, who did affect me. You never know who gets you when. I remember Robert Mason saying to me, it's just as well you didn't read James Branch Cabell when you were young, or you'd have been stuck trying to imitate him. And he was quite right. I missed Cabell when I was at an impressionable age. I would have tried to write like that.
Mm.
In the same way that, if you like, that Ray Bradbury was very much affected by Tolkien, by Thomas Wolfe, as a young writer. And he never altogether shook off the influence, which was okay.
Yeah.
But he admitted himself that Thomas Wolfe was a very, very important influence on his work. Mm-hmm. It depends when they catch you and at what age.
Yeah, the Cable was actually, because I live in Sweden right now, and Cable was quite popular here when he was active, which is strange because Sweden has, well, now in later years it's definitely changed, but Sweden has never been, the Swedish literary establishment has never really been very fond of particularly fantasy. Science fiction seems to be all right, but I mean, I remember growing up, it was definitely frowned upon as a genre. I think a lot. I know I had this discussion with an author many years ago when we were discussing it, and he said, "Well, here in Sweden we have our own myths and legends." And
you certainly do, and a lot of American writers have been imitating them ever since.
Yes. So he felt that it was more important that we care for those instead of trying to get influenced by other genres or writers.
You never know. I know that I corresponded by email for years with somebody I never met, a wonderful English novelist named Diana Norman.
Okay.
She had written a book set in the 12th century that I wanted to have written, and she'd already done it infinitely better than I possibly could have. And I wrote to her website on a whim, "You cost me a book." And the amazing thing is that she wrote back. And we corresponded 2 and sometimes 3 times a week for years until she died very suddenly. She was about only 5 years older than I. But we talked about everything, including writing. I can remember saying I always had the problem of feeling, sooner or later, I start feeling sorry for my villains. And Diana wrote back, "Oh, I can't do that. I can only do psychos." And she created some of the most truly scary psychos I can think of in at least 2 novels. I couldn't have done that. And to this day, I collect her books and I reread them, and I shake my head thinking, damn, Diana, how did you do that? I can't do that. And I wish she hadn't died when she was married to somebody much more famous than she was, the British film critic Barry Norman.
Oh.
And when she died, I wrote to him, I emailed him, "Dear Mr. Norman, I loved your wife." And bless him, he emailed me back, "Dear Peter, I think since we both love the same woman, we can skip the formalities."
I was thinking about you have or are going to release a book called New Voices of Fantasy.
I was one of the 2 editors.
Yeah, And I was kind of wondering what your thoughts on how fantasy has developed and changed over the years, where it came from, maybe from your time. I mean, we don't have to go all the way back to
Oh, good.
Tolkien or anything like that, but how it's developed and where you see it going. Because I think a lot of people, and when I talk to students a lot, because I'm a teacher, they always find that fantasy is one of the more static genres. If you don't
I don't
read
think
it.
so.
No, if you don't read it, I think that's kind of like the idea a lot of people. And I remember definitely having this conversation with my grandparents when they were still alive, who almost only read detective stories. But
I read detective stories, heaven knows. I wish I could write one.
So I was wondering where you see what has changed, what is happening in the world of fantasy today that is more than maybe Martin's Game of Thrones or
Back in the 1980s, my editor at Valentine Books, Del Rey Books, Judy Lynn Del Rey, sent me this immense manuscript that she wanted me to do a blurb for, called The Sword of Shannara. And I got some way into it and then called Judy Lynn to tell her, Judy Lynn, this isn't simply a point-for-point imitation of Tolkien. This is an 8th grade imitation of Tolkien. And Judy Lynn said for me, Judy Lynn knew great literature and she knew garbage, and she would publish anything if she felt it would sell. And she said, never mind, I'm going to make $1 million on this one. This is written for people who have read The Lord of the Rings 40 times and can't quite get it up for the 41st. And she was dead right. And it wasn't just that book. She did sell $1 million, certainly. And it set off a wave of imitation Tolkien and imitation Frank Frazetta covers. And there were people I'd never heard of, hadn't read. Some, a handful were actually good. Remember, in the field, there's a thing you may have heard, a saying called Sturgeon's Law, when it was point out to Theodore Sturgeon that he really was a very good stylist. It wasn't just ideas and characters. He had, as they would have said then, a touch of the poet. He's a very good writer. And he really shouldn't bother with this genre, science fiction, because after all, 95% of it was crap. And Sturgeon's response was, that's perfectly true. But 95% of everything is crap. And that's known to this day as Sturgeon's Law. And he was quite right. So the 95% of those 1980s books were crap. But what amazes me is that so much has changed for better. There are so many more women in the field, for one thing. So many more young women writing really good stuff. And there are subjects that never used to be even considered as fit matter for science fiction. I can remember being on a panel in the mid-'70s in Corvallis, Oregon. It's Oregon State University. And I was on a panel which was two old friends, Ursula Le Guin on one side of me and Vonda McIntyre on the other. I'm happily sitting in the middle, letting them talk. I'm cool. But there was a kind of rustling in the back, so to speak. The boys letting it be known that they'd come to hear some good old rocket jockey science fiction, not this shrill feminism. And Ursula, without missing a beat, peered around me and said, Vonda, how many times have I told you about being shrill? And Vonda, as though they'd been planning this, peered in the other direction around me and said, no, Ursula, dear, I'm strident. You're shrill. And I'm sitting in the middle, cracking up. But Ursula turned a lot of things around when she wrote The Left Hand of Darkness. With its unspecified sexual preference genres. People, can wake up, wake up as other sexes. Sex can be changed. And I think of that now, when I've got 3 friends, all of whose children have shaken up the family to one degree or another by going through sexual transition. That could never have been covered in fantasy or science fiction back then. Now it's covered all the time. You still get classic fairy tale style out of the deep woods, so to speak, with not fairy godmothers, but certainly witches. Witches, that's another thing. Witches have become heroines or heroes. And I'm absolutely fascinated by these changes, and I definitely think they're for the better. As always, 95% are crap, but the field is so much more full of possibilities. It's like my theory about presidential elections, that it should be a national lottery in this country, that it's open to everybody, chosen by pure lottery, and you have to go. You can't simply say that you're the sole support of an ailing mother. No way out. You have to go and become president. And yes, of course, as people point out, we get all kinds of loonies, but we do anyway. We do anyway, and at least we broaden the field of loonies.
That's true. So what is it? What can people expect from the new voices of fantasy? When I was looking at, and I fancy myself a reader of quite a bit of fantasy, but I could honestly say that I didn't recognize very many of the names, if really any, of the authors that are included.
Almost all of them have published to one degree or another, but I'm very proud of the choice. In honesty, while I read all of the stories and commented on them, the heavy lifting was done by my publisher, Jacob Weisman, who gets much smaller print than I do, and I complained about it. But as Jacob said simply, you're the big name. He's quite a good writer himself, and he's an excellent editor. But he did the bulk of the work, bringing the stories to me and weeding them out from any number of, God knows how many submissions there were. But these are all to me, all new. And some styles are recognizable and readable. Some fascinate me because I like the idea of this story, but I've never tried it like that. And the kid got away with it. Look at that. And so I'm just admiring and wondering and thinking about that. Would I have written that when I was their age? Oh, I don't think so. I don't think that would have occurred to me. Look at that. And the reviews have been wonderful. And I'm delighted to see it and feel very proud of my connection with the book. But I just feel that the possibilities have broadened out so much in the recent years, and certainly in the almost 60 years that I've been doing this. I'm just dumbfounded and very proud of having had anything at all to do with it.
Well, that's definitely one that I'll have to pick up and read myself.
It is worth it.
Looks very interesting, and it's always interesting to see new takes on old things, which is always, I think, the most difficult part, to get a new kind of angle on a genre or a style or a theme.
I never think that I'm doing anything other than the traditional storytelling. I'm amazed when anybody thinks, I have, but I am proud of the fact that I think of it with the Innkeepers song, which is still probably my favorite of my own books. I think I actually might have had the first group sex scene in modern fantasy. I didn't know it was going to come out like that. I was as astonished as anybody else. But I'm still quite proud of it. Maybe one day it'll be thought of as a pioneering work. Who knows?
No, maybe. We'll have to. Well, only time can tell.
Only.
I think we're kind of winding down here. I don't want to take up too much of your time. What can people expect from you in the coming years? What's next? You're going to finish your work.
I'll finish Sue's one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are the books that I've thought of for years. Well, I'll do that when I'm a little older and I know a little more about what I'm doing. And I think I am a little older. And I know about as much as I'm going to know as far as technique is concerned. I know what I can do and to a large extent what I can't. But there are several books that I hope I get around to doing. I live long enough to do, including one that has to do with, it's contemporary in the sense that it's set in America, but it's the Hollywood of just before World War II, the Hollywood of 1939 and 1940. It has to do with the relationship that did exist, however loose it was, between several of the great horror movie actors, Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi and Lon Chaney Jr., and not that he was a horror movie actor at the time, Peter Lorre, because I heard him talking on radio broadcast years ago about that relationship, about how you have to remember all of us had set out to be something else. Boris was a trained Shakespearean actor who was driving trucks for quite a while. Bela had played Shakespeare on stage in Hungary. Lon Chaney Jr. wasn't named Lon Chaney Jr. to begin with, and he didn't want to be an actor. He didn't want to be anything his abusive father was, but there was no other way for him to make a living. Lorre said, I think he was trained as a plumber, and there was no other way for him to make a living but to become Lon Chaney Jr. He said, I wasn't supposed to be an actor at all, so I was supposed to be a psychiatrist. I'm the only guy I know who studied with both Freud and Adler. It was just that I had this midnight other career where I did what you'd call impressions or stand-up. And one of my big impressions that people always asked me to do was this little nut with a mustache who was running around Berlin demanding, make me chancellor. And the day that Hitler became chancellor, Lorre literally left town. Went first to France and then to the United States eventually. But I always wanted that, if I'm going to do it, I'd like the narrator to be the great screenwriter who wrote The Wolfman, among other things, Kurt Siodmak. Would make a wonderful narrator. I met him once when he was about 90. And he lived to be 98 and had been married to the same woman for 75 years, which fascinates me all by itself. But yeah, that's one novel I've had in mind for a long time. Another has to do with, the only sport I know well from the inside because I played it, baseball. Always wanted to write a baseball fantasy. And so there's just things, I really would like to do. Whether or not I'm capable of it, I don't know. But it's either keep working, or as Robert Nathan said to me once, it's not that he felt old. It was more that he felt prehistoric. He felt like the last pterodactyl in the whole world. There's nothing much you can do with the last pterodactyl but stuff it and put it in a glass case. And dearly as I love Robert, I don't want to feel like the last pterodactyl.
No. Although it sounds like interesting and especially fascinated of this the old Hollywood story. I've been reading the comic book.
I'll tell you one.
Yeah.
I'll tell you one thing. Robert Nathan was married to the English actress Anna Lee, who had a career literally of 70 years. She started young and she was still acting at 90. And she was very proud of having done 2 movies with Boris Karloff. And I used to ask people of Anna's age, Anna's career, about those people, about if they'd worked with those actors. And without exception, everybody, like Anna, who had worked with Karloff, would smile affectionately and say, "Dear Boris." And people who had worked with Bela Lugosi looked sad and would just shake their heads and say, "Poor Bela." And I just collected stories like that for some suggestion of what those people might have been like. Kurt Siodmak remembered Boris Karloff, who was a neighbor, coming over in the evenings to tell British fairy tales to Siodmak's little boy. And in the end, of course, you write what seems like a good idea at the time. I might yet have that on my tombstone. It seemed like a good idea at the time.
I was reading a comic book by Alan Moore.
Oh, sure.
Which is called Cinema Purgatorio, and every story, every issue is a form of Hollywood myth from the early days of Hollywood, and they're really interesting. A lot of stuff that I some of the stuff that I knew, and some of the things that I had no idea about. The creator of Felix the Cat, for instance, his backstory is actually quite tragic story, actually, and the Bat, the first movie about the Bat, kind of like the precursor to Batman and stuff like that. So it's quite interesting.
Sure.
It's an interesting.
I was a great. I had the only surgery I've ever had done was on my mouth for implants, and I remember waiting for the anesthesia to take hold while the dentist and the dental surgeon were discussing over my body a shared belief that that the only real Batman was Mr. West.
Yeah.
And I was trying to agree with them when I just went out and didn't wake up for 3 hours. But to this day, I still think, yeah, Adam West, absolutely. That's the moral example for us all. And I still think like that.
Yeah, I would be inclined to agree. Well, I'd like to thank you for taking the time and telling such wonderful stories and giving us a little bit of an insight in your writing and your thoughts and how everything works, even if the way you do it you wouldn't recommend to other people.
Definitely not. It might tell you something about my influence. I'll say this quickly, that I was wildly jealous when Neil Gaiman got to do the introduction to the new edition of James Thurber's The 13 Clocks.
All right.
Damn it, I want to do that. and the same way, only one person has ever picked out the resemblance, the connection between The Last Unicorn and another fairy tale of James Thurber, written about 1945, called The White Deer. There was a definite connection, and the only person who has ever picked it up was the songwriter, composer, the guy who did the score for musicals like Wicked, Stephen Schwartz.
All right.
As a consequence, Stephen Schwartz and I have autographed copies of The White Deer. We've autographed them for each other.
Oh. Well, that was yeah. But yes, as I said, thank you for taking the time. And I'm sure our listeners appreciate this. You were telling me that you're not around on social media. Where can people?
Not at all.
Is there a place where people can find updates on what you're doing, or?
There is a website called The Real Peter S Beagle, as distinguished from various things put out by my former business manager. But the real Peter S Beagle is genuine, and it's looked after by my publisher and my lawyer.
That's good, and that's where people can find you. Are you still doing tours? I know you were doing tours with The Last Unicorn movie, whether screenings. Is that still going on?
Not with me, certainly. I don't tour a lot. I have a gig this afternoon on a writing panel. If the Pirates haven't put that one out, and that's on Fairfield, California, and I will be at a convention in Utah, I think it's Layton, Utah, in next year, and it's mostly, if I'm asked, and if my lawyer, who's sort of become somewhat of my mother, thinks it won't wear me out, and if there's actual money in it, or there's somebody I've always wanted to meet, or a friend I don't get to see otherwise, like recently, I went to a wedding in Houston, because they said people getting married were friends of mine. Mostly I'm here in my room, going around in circles, mumbling, all right, come damn it, think. In fact, I had a little faded index card on my wall years ago that just said two words on it, think, schmuck, which is mostly what I say to myself in moments of crisis. Come on, think, schmuck, like that.
Well,
anyway, it's been good talking. Go ahead.
Yes, no, I was going to say, well, maybe that's a good note to end on.
That's one I recommend. Yes.
Thank you very much for taking the time, and all the best in the future. We're looking forward to everything that you produce coming up, and hopefully you can keep at it for quite some time.
Well, I appear to be in perfectly good health. I'm still walking around. As long as my legs hold out, I'll hold out.
Okay.
Like that.
Well, thank you very much.
You're very welcome, Chris. Thanks for calling.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, that's it for another edition of the Guild podcast. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed taking part in it. I would like to thank Jim DeMaiolo from Tachyon Publishing for setting this up. I would like to obviously thank Peter S Beagle for taking the time to talk to us. And I would especially like to thank my brother-in-law, Eric Irenaeus, who wrote the music for this episode. An original piece, very nice. If you like what you heard, give us a like on social media of various forums. We're on Instagram, where we have our own homepage. We're on YouTube, SoundCloud, and Facebook, and also Twitter. And I think that does it for tonight. My name is C. Mary Hultman, and I hope to talk to you sooner than later.